In the heart of a tightly controlled military base in Texas, a forbidden connection sparks between two unlikely souls, Captain William Harris, a man of discipline and honor, and Sarah Morgan, a fearless journalist digging into the shadows of military life. As their professional boundaries blur, whispers of corruption and betrayal begin to surface. But what begins as a passionate escape from their separate realities soon spirals into a deadly game of secrets and lies. How far will they go to protect each other when every step they take draws them closer to danger? Before we continue, friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but for me, it's an extra motivation to keep creating videos. I'd also really appreciate a comment. Thank you for your support, and now let's continue with the story. The Texas sun burned brightly over the sprawling military base, casting sharp shadows across the barracks and the meticulously maintained grounds. The rhythmic clang of marching boots echoed through the air as soldiers drilled in perfect unison, their discipline a testament to the leadership of Captain William Harris. Standing tall at the edge of the training field, his presence was commanding yet approachable. His crisp uniform bore the insignia of his rank with pride, but it was the respect in the eyes of his men that truly defined him. William Harris was the kind of officer others aspired to emulate. His reputation extended far beyond the base. He was a war hero, a strategic mastermind, and a family man, or so it seemed. Behind his carefully constructed facade, there was a subtle weariness in his eyes, the kind that only those closest to him might notice. But on this particular morning, the weight of his responsibilities was momentarily lifted by the arrival of someone unexpected. Sarah Morgan stepped out of a black sedan, her sharp heels clicking against the pavement. Her tailored blazer and press badge screamed professionalism, but her piercing gaze revealed an unyielding curiosity. She surveyed the base with the air of someone accustomed to uncovering truths hidden in plain sight. This wasn't her first time on a military installation, but something about the atmosphere here felt different. More guarded, more secretive. As Sarah approached the central office, she caught sight of William. Their eyes met briefly, and though the exchange was fleeting, it carried a strange electricity. For a moment, he hesitated, his usual composed demeanor faltering slightly. Then, as if shaking off a thought that didn't belong, he extended his hand. "Captain Harris," he said, his voice steady and professional. "You must be Miss Morgan." "Please, call me Sarah," she replied with a disarming smile. Her handshake was firm, her confidence palpable. "Thank you for allowing me access. I know military bases aren't exactly open books." "We believe in transparency," William replied, though the words felt rehearsed. Within reason, of course. The formalities dissolved as he led her on a tour of the base. She asked questions, some straightforward, others pointed. Her inquiries about recent operations were met with carefully measured answers, but William's deflections only fueled her determination. He couldn't help but notice her sharp wit and the way she seemed to peel back layers with every question. As they walked through the barracks and training grounds, Sarah's mind worked in overdrive. Something about this base felt off, and she was determined to find out what. But more than that, she was drawn to the man walking beside her. There was a depth to him, a vulnerability just beneath the surface of his polished exterior. That evening, Sarah lingered at the officers' lounge, nursing a cup of coffee as she reviewed her notes. The lounge was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of passing soldiers. She didn't expect to see William again, but as the door creaked open, there he was, looking less formal and more human in his off-duty attire. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his tone lighter than earlier. He gestured to the chair across from her. "Mind if I join?" She nodded, surprised by the casualness of his approach. They talked about nothing and everything: her work, his years in the military, the sacrifices both their careers demanded. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time, William felt a sense of ease he hadn't known in years. But beneath the surface, both knew the risks of this connection. For Sarah, the potential story of corruption on the base could be career-defining or career-ending. For William, the boundaries of duty and personal desire were already beginning to blur. As the night deepened, the tension between them grew, unspoken but undeniable. By the time they parted, the air was heavy with unsaid words. William watched her leave, a strange mixture of regret and longing tightening in his chest. For Sarah, the encounter left her both exhilarated and conflicted. She had come to the base searching for a story, but she hadn't expected to find this. A man who was quickly becoming more than just an interview subject. Neither of them realized it yet, but their paths were set on a collision course that would unravel everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The base felt different that night. The air was heavier, the darkness deeper, as if the shadows carried secrets too dangerous to see in the light. Sarah sat at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop illuminating her face as she scrolled through a maze of reports. Her findings were coming together, a web of inconsistencies that hinted at something far larger than she'd anticipated. Supply orders that didn't match delivery records, equipment that vanished without explanation. Details small enough to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore in their entirety. Someone on this base was hiding something, and they were willing to go to great lengths to keep it buried. Her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. She hesitated before checking it. Another text from the anonymous number. Curiosity kills more than just cats. Her breath hitched. The message was more direct than before, less veiled. A faint noise outside drew her attention. A soft shuffle, almost imperceptible. Sarah glanced toward the window but saw nothing beyond the swaying branches of a tree. She told herself it was nothing, but her pulse quickened all the same. The sensation of being watched had lingered since her arrival, but now it felt suffocating. She returned to the screen, forcing her focus back to the files. The next set of documents revealed something chilling. Equipment requisitions linked to a private contractor with ties to arms deals under federal investigation. The name was buried deep, hidden under layers of bureaucratic jargon, but it was there. Whoever was behind this wasn't just stealing supplies. They were feeding a far-reaching operation. Her mind reeled as she connected the dots, but her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Who is it?" she called, keeping her voice steady. "It's William." His voice was calm, familiar, but it carried an undercurrent of urgency. She opened the door to find him standing there, his expression tense. He stepped inside quickly, glancing over his shoulder before shutting the door. "You're being watched," he said, cutting straight to the point. Sarah folded her arms. "I figured as much. This isn't just about your investigation anymore," he continued, his tone grave. "There's a reason you've been getting those messages. Someone knows you're close to something they don't want exposed." "What do you know?" she pressed, her voice sharp. Instead of answering, he handed her a file, thin, unassuming, but heavy with implication. She opened it to find a set of grainy photographs. They showed her meeting a fellow journalist weeks before arriving on the base. The images were covertly taken, the angles suggesting a skilled observer. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were left on my desk this morning," he admitted. No note, no explanation. Sarah studied the photos, her stomach nodding. Whoever had taken them had been watching her long before she arrived. But why? William watched her carefully. "That journalist, are they connected to your investigation?" She hesitated. "No, at least not directly. We worked on something similar a year ago, but they don't know I'm here." "Someone wants you to think they do," he said. "They're trying to isolate you, make you doubt who you can trust." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Sarah realized she was gripping the edge of the file too tightly, her knuckles white. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. William's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Because this is bigger than either of us. And because if I don't think you'll make it out of here." The vulnerability in his words unsettled her. For a man so accustomed to control, this moment of honesty was a risk, and she felt the full weight of it. Their conversation was cut short by a loud crash outside. Both of them froze, instincts kicking in. William motioned for her to stay put as he moved to the window. Peering through the blinds, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure disappearing into the shadows. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low but commanding. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there alone." He hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect and the reality of their situation. Then stay close, he said finally. They stepped outside together, the night enveloping them in its uneasy quiet. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified. William's hand hovered near his sidearm as they moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. Near the edge of the building, they found a shattered light fixture. But that wasn't what stopped them. Scratched into the concrete wall beneath it was a single word. Leave. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. William scanned the area, his body tense, but whoever had been there was long gone. We need to report this, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. William shook his head. Not yet. This kind of thing. It'll just disappear in the system. Then what do? We find out who's behind it, he said firmly. Back inside, William double-checked the locks on her door before leaving. Keep your phone on, he said. I'll be in touch. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sarah sank into her chair, her mind racing. The threats were escalating, and she knew they wouldn't stop until she was silenced, or until she uncovered the truth. In his own quarters, William sat staring at the photos again. Something about them felt deliberate, too convenient. He didn't know who had left them or why, but one thing was clear. Whoever had taken them wasn't just watching Sarah. They were watching him, too. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to press closer as he reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad before he typed a message. We need to talk. Now. The reply came almost instantly. Midnight. Same place. The weight of what lay ahead bore down on him as the clock ticked closer to the hour. In the stillness of the night, the storm was gathering, and they were both standing in its path. The steel sky over the base seemed heavier than usual as Sarah flipped through the last of the files William had given her. Ardent Solutions was more than just a logistics company. It was the thread connecting half a dozen shadowy operations. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Missing shipments, falsified requisition forms, and a web of payments funneled through dummy corporations. The most damning document was buried in an innocuous report. A signed memo from Colonel Hayes authorizing an emergency rerouting of equipment to an undisclosed location. The memo was dated 6 months ago, just before a major operation had mysteriously been delayed. Rerouting, she muttered under her breath. To where? A faint knock interrupted her train of thought. When she opened the door, Sergeant Myers stood there, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and an envelope in the other. Thought you might need this, he said, nodding toward the cup. Sarah accepted it cautiously. Myers had been helpful, but his blank demeanor gave little away. More files, she asked, gesturing toward the envelope. Something like that, he replied. I figured it might save you some time. As she opened the envelope, her heart sank. Inside was a series of surveillance photos, taken from various angles around the base. Some showed her working at her desk, others walking with William, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. One image, more recent, depicted her entering her quarters the previous night, shortly before the carved message had appeared. Where did you get these? She demanded, her voice sharp. I have my sources, Myers said. Let's just say not everyone here wants Hayes to keep running the show. Her mind raced. If Myers had access to these photos, what else did he know? And why was he sharing them with her now? Why are you helping me? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Myers hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the hallway. I lost a lot of good people because of Hayes, he said finally. I'm not going to sit by while he uses this base as his personal playground. But don't mistake this for friendship, Morgan. You're useful to me. For now. The bluntness of his words stung, but they also carried a strange honesty. She decided not to push further, watching as Myers turned and disappeared down the corridor. Back inside, Sarah spread the photos across her desk. The images were too precise, the angles too deliberate, to be the work of an amateur. Whoever was behind them had resources, and a clear intent to intimidate. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from William. Meet me at the Eastern Depot. Bring what you've found. The Eastern Depot was quiet when Sarah arrived. Rows of crates stretched into the shadows, their markings faded but still legible. William stood near the back, his posture rigid. He didn't look up as she approached, his focus on a clipboard in his hands. "You're late," he said, though his tone lacked any real bite. "Ran into Myers," she replied, handing him the envelope of photos. "He thought I might find these interesting." William flipped through the pictures, his jaw tightening. This isn't just Hayes' work. He has people everywhere, contractors, soldiers, even civilians. They're watching everyone, not just us. "Why haven't you told anyone?" she asked. "The higher-ups. Someone outside this base." "Because Hayes has leverage," William interrupted. "Enough to make this disappear before it even reaches the chain of command. He's been doing this for years, Morgan. You don't build a network like his without covering every angle." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and for a moment, she glimpsed the weight he carried. Whatever lines he had crossed to protect his men, this was different. This was personal. Before she could respond, a faint sound echoed through the depot. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, growing closer. William motioned for her to stay back as he moved toward the entrance, his hand instinctively resting on the holster at his side. A figure emerged from the shadows. Myers, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," William said, his voice low. Myers shrugged. "Neither should you." For a moment, the tension between them was palpable. Then Myers reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded map, handing it to William. "These are the coordinates for Hayes' shipments," he said. "They're using an old airstrip about 10 miles from here. If you want proof, that's where you'll find it." William studied the map, his brow furrowing. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I want him gone as much as you do," Myers replied. "But you didn't hear it from me." He turned to leave, but Sarah stepped forward. "Wait, if Hayes finds out—" "He won't," Myers said sharply, cutting her off. "Just make sure you're careful. This isn't a game, Morgan. People don't walk away from this clean." And then he was gone, leaving them in the heavy silence of the depot. The drive to the airstrip was tense, the map clutched tightly in William's hand as he navigated the deserted backroads. Sarah sat beside him, her thoughts racing. She could feel the shift between them, an unspoken understanding forged in the crucible of shared danger. When they reached the airstrip, the scene was eerily quiet. The rusted hangars loomed in the moonlight, their corrugated walls pockmarked with age. William killed the engine, and they stepped out, their breaths visible in the cool night air. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice barely audible. They moved toward the nearest hangar, their footsteps muffled by the packed dirt. Inside, rows of crates lined the walls, each marked with the Ardent Solutions logo. Sarah's pulse quickened as she approached one, prying it open to reveal stacks of military-grade weapons. "This is it," she whispered, her voice tinged with both triumph and dread. But before they could inspect further, a voice rang out behind them. "Step away from the crates." They turned to find Colonel Hayes standing at the entrance, flanked by 2 armed men. His expression was calm, almost amused. "You've been busy," Hayes said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But I'm afraid this is where your little investigation ends." William stepped forward, positioning himself between Hayes and Sarah. "You can't cover this up forever." Hayes chuckled. "I don't need to. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, you'll both be long gone." The armed men raised their weapons, and for a moment, the air was thick with the threat of violence. But then, from the shadows, another voice called out, "Drop your weapons." It was Myers leading a small team of soldiers, their rifles trained on Hayes' men. The balance of power shifted in an instant, but the look on Hayes' face didn't falter. "You think this changes anything?" Hayes sneered. "I built this operation. You really believe you can dismantle it with a few guns and a map?" The tension snapped as one of Hayes' men lunged for his weapon, chaos erupting in the confined space. Gunfire echoed through the hangar as Sarah and William dove for cover, the crates splintering under the barrage. When the dust settled, Hayes was gone, his men subdued but the mastermind of the operation slipping away into the night. Breathing heavily, William turned to Sarah. "This isn't over." She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Not even close. The cabin's air was thick with the sharp scent of aged wood and damp earth, its walls creaking under the pressure of the night wind. The single overhead bulb flickered as Sarah spread the latest intel across the warped table. The dim light threw jagged shadows on William and Myers, who stood at opposite ends of the room, their postures tense and unreadable. "You're sure it's Delaney?" William asked, leaning over to examine a grainy photo. His voice carried an edge, as though he'd already decided the answer mattered more than the question. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the image of Marcus Delaney stepping out of his polished black SUV at the warehouse. His tailored suit and easy confidence made him stand out against the gritty industrial backdrop. "He's more than a backer. He's directly involved," she said. "Look at him. He's not just visiting. He's running this." Myers shifted, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots. "Delaney doesn't run anything without a reason," he said. "He's a problem solver. Hayes must have called him in to clean up the mess." William's jaw tightened. "Or to deal with us." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Myers crossed his arms, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "If you're questioning whether I'm part of this, Harris, just say it." "I'm not questioning anything," William replied coldly, his gaze steady. "I just don't trust coincidences." Sarah shot a look at both men, her voice cutting through the rising heat. "We don't have time for this," she snapped. "Delaney being there changes everything. If we're going to stop that shipment, we need to be smarter than they are." For a moment, no one spoke. Then William moved to the table, his finger tapping the map Myers had provided. "There are 3 main entry points to the warehouse. 2 lead directly to the loading docks. The third gives us access to the control center, where we can disable the trucks. If we can isolate Hayes and Delaney, we might stand a chance. And if we can't?" Myers asked, his tone flat. William's gaze was like steel. "Then we improvise." The warehouse loomed like a fortress on the edge of the industrial district, its towering walls and stark floodlights casting eerie pools of light onto the gravel lot. The smell of oil and metal hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint hum of machinery. Trucks lined the docks, their engines rumbling softly as workers loaded crates into their trailers. Sarah, crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, scanned the activity through a pair of binoculars. She counted 6 guards, all heavily armed, patrolling the perimeter. Inside the building, shadows moved between rows of crates, their presence confirming the scale of the operation. William's voice crackled softly in her earpiece. "Any sign of Delaney?" "Not yet," she whispered, "but Hayes is here. He's overseeing the loading." Myers' voice joined the conversation, low and steady. "We've got a 30-minute window before those trucks roll out. After that, we're done." Sarah glanced at William, who was hidden behind a shipping container nearby. His hand rested on the rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the lot with laser focus. He gave her a subtle nod, and she felt a flicker of reassurance. Whatever happened, they were in this together. The plan was simple in theory. Myers would create a distraction near the southern gate, drawing the guards away from the main building. Sarah and William would use the chaos to slip inside, locate the control center, and shut down the trucks. But the presence of Delaney, still unseen, added a layer of unpredictability they couldn't afford to ignore. When the explosion came, it was deafening. Flames erupted near the southern gate, lighting up the night sky and sending guards scrambling toward the source. Myers' diversion had begun. William signaled to Sarah, and they moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they approached the warehouse. The sound of shouting echoed through the lot, the guards' disorganized movements creating a narrow window of opportunity. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of crates and machinery. The air was stifling, heavy with the smell of fuel and sweat. Sarah's heart pounded as they navigated the maze, her grip tightening on the small pistol Myers had handed her earlier. They reached the control center without incident, the small room perched on a mezzanine overlooking the main floor. William picked the lock with practiced efficiency, and they slipped inside. The hum of computers filled the space, their screens displaying a live feed of the loading docks. "Can you shut them down?" William asked, his voice low. Sarah moved to the nearest terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Give me a minute." But as the first truck's engine cut off, a voice from behind sent ice through her veins. "Step away from the console." She turned slowly, her breath catching as she saw Delaney standing in the doorway, a pistol aimed at her chest. His expression was calm, almost bored, as though this was just another business meeting. William moved to intercept, but Delaney's men appeared behind him, their weapons drawn. "Don't bother," Delaney said. "You're outnumbered." "Not for long," William replied, his tone sharp. "The police are on their way. This whole operation is about to go up in flames." Delaney chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. "You give me too much credit, Captain. This isn't my operation. This Hayes. I'm just here to make sure he doesn't embarrass himself further." "Then why are you holding a gun?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Delaney's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. "Because Hayes isn't the only one with something to lose. And if you think I'll let you destroy years of work with a few keystrokes, you're more naive than I thought." Before he could say more, a new sound cut through the tension. Gunfire, coming from the main floor. Chaos erupted as Myers appeared, leading a group of soldiers into the warehouse. The distraction was enough for William to act, disarming one of Delaney's men with a swift, brutal motion. Sarah dove for cover as bullets tore through the control room, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Delaney retreated, his men covering his escape as he disappeared into the chaos below. "Can you finish shutting them down?" William shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. Sarah nodded, returning to the console and resuming her work. One by one, the trucks fell silent, their engines disabled. But as the last screen went dark, a new problem emerged. Hayes, flanked by reinforcements, stormed into the warehouse, his voice booming. "Find them," he shouted, "and kill them all." William pulled Sarah away from the console, his grip firm. "We need to move. Now." They slipped out of the control room as the gunfire intensified, the warehouse descending into a full-blown war zone. Sarah's chest tightened as she realized just how precarious their situation had become. As they reached the edge of the warehouse, a massive explosion shook the ground, sending crates and debris flying. Sarah turned to see one of the trucks engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly. "Keep moving," William urged, his voice cutting through the chaos. They emerged into the cool night air, but the danger was far from over. The warehouse burned behind them, the flames casting long shadows as Hayes and his men regrouped. Delaney was nowhere to be seen, and Myers was still inside, his fate uncertain. William glanced at Sarah, his eyes filled with determination. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "It's just beginning." The forest pressed in around them, the tall pines swaying ominously in the faint moonlight. The ground was a tangle of roots and fallen needles that caught at Sarah's boots as she tried to keep up with William's steady pace. Myers lagged behind, limping but refusing help, his face a mask of pain and defiance. Each step away from the burning warehouse felt like borrowed time, the distant shouts of Hayes' men driving them deeper into the shadows. "Slow down," Myers rasped, leaning heavily against a tree. His forehead glistened with sweat, and the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage at his side darkened. "Unless you want me to bleed out here." William stopped and turned, his expression unreadable in the faint light. "We don't have time to stop," he said, though his voice softened at the sight of Myers' condition. "Yeah, well, time's something we don't have much of," Myers shot back, wincing as he straightened. "But neither of you are getting out of this alive without me." Sarah frowned, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping closer. Myers gave a dry, humorless laugh. "You think Hayes ran this whole operation himself? He's got people everywhere. You think that depot you're so eager to hit hasn't been reinforced by now? Then why are you still with us?" William asked, his voice sharp. "If Hayes is so untouchable, why haven't you cut your losses?" For a moment, Myers didn't answer. His eyes flicked between them, his jaw tight. Because I owe people, he said finally. People Hayes took from me. I played along long enough to see what he was really doing, and by the time I realized, it was too late to stop him. You're the only shot I've got. The honesty in his voice caught Sarah off guard, and for a fleeting second, she saw the man behind the gruff exterior. A man haunted by his own complicity. We keep moving, William said, breaking the moment. If Hayes knows we're coming, we'll deal with it when we get there. The trio pushed forward, the forest thickening as they descended into a narrow ravine. The air grew colder, damp with the smell of moss and stagnant water. The faint hum of distant machinery reached Sarah's ears before she saw the depot, its angular silhouette rising from the earth like a fortress. The depot was smaller than the warehouse but no less intimidating. Razor wire curled along the perimeter fence, and floodlights swept the compound in methodical arcs. Guards moved in pairs, their shadows long against the concrete walls. A single steel door marked the entrance, flanked by a biometric scanner and 2 armed men. Sarah's stomach twisted as she crouched behind a fallen tree with William and Myers, taking in the scene. This looks impossible, she whispered. It always does, William replied. But we've got one advantage. They're not expecting us this soon. Yeah, Myers said with a grim smile. Let's hope they don't have a backup plan. The plan was simple in theory. Myers would cause a distraction near the generator shed on the far side of the compound, drawing as many guards away as possible. William and Sarah would enter through a drainage tunnel Myers had used once before during a smuggling operation, one of the many skeletons he'd alluded to but never fully revealed. As Myers disappeared into the shadows, Sarah felt the tension between her and William crystallize into something almost tangible. He glanced at her, his eyes searching hers for a moment. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Neither do you, she replied, her voice steady. But we're here. He nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. Then, with a sharp motion, he led the way toward the tunnel. The drainage tunnel was narrow and foul, the stench of stagnant water making Sarah gag. The walls were slick with grime, and the distant sound of machinery echoed ominously, masking their footsteps. William moved ahead, his flashlight casting long shadows, while Sarah followed, gripping her bag tightly. When they reached the end of the tunnel, William pressed his ear to the rusted grate that barred their exit. He signaled for silence, his body tense as he listened. Satisfied, he pried the grate open and climbed out, helping Sarah up after him. They emerged into a storage bay, its walls lined with crates stamped with the Ardent Solutions logo. The air was cooler here, humming with the soft vibration of industrial fans. William motioned for her to stay close as they slipped between the stacks of crates, heading toward the control room where the vault was located. But as they neared the control room, a faint click stopped them in their tracks. William froze, his hand shooting up in warning. Sarah's heart pounded as she followed his gaze to a small, blinking light embedded in the ceiling. A hidden camera. We're made, William muttered. Move. Now. The calm of the depot shattered as an alarm blared, red lights flooding the bay. Voices shouted orders, and the sound of boots on concrete echoed through the corridors. William grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her into a side hallway just as a group of guards entered the bay, their weapons raised. We'll never make it to the vault now, Sarah panted, her mind racing. William's eyes burned with determination. Then we make them come to us. They doubled back toward the generator shed, where Myers was supposed to be setting up his distraction. The sight that greeted them stopped Sarah cold. Myers, standing in the middle of the shed, holding a detonator in one hand and a pistol in the other. Around him, Hayes' men were sprawled on the ground, unconscious or worse. You're late, Myers said, his grin feral. But I saved you a spot. Where's Hayes? William demanded. Right behind you, a cold voice replied. They turned to see Hayes stepping into the shed, a pistol aimed squarely at Sarah. He looked composed, even smug, his eyes glittering with satisfaction. Impressive work, Hayes said, his voice dripping with condescension. But you should have known better than to come here. Myers shifted, his hand tightening on the detonator. You think you've won? Hayes' smirk widened. I know I have. And when this place goes up, so will every piece of evidence you've gathered. For a heartbeat, the room held its collective breath. Then Myers acted, throwing the detonator to William as he lunged for Hayes. The two men grappled, their struggle violent and chaotic as William and Sarah scrambled to escape. Go! Myers shouted, his voice raw. Finish it! William hesitated, his eyes locking with Myers for a split second. Then he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her out of the shed as the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. They ran toward the vault, the chaos of the depot unfolding around them. Guards fired blindly, their shouts blending with the wail of the alarm. The depot shook as an explosion ripped through the generator shed, plunging the compound into darkness. The vault loomed ahead, its reinforced door glowing faintly in the dim emergency lighting. William and Sarah reached it just as the power failed completely, plunging them into silence. What now? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. William pulled a small device from his pocket, its lights blinking faintly. Now, he said, his voice steady, we finish this. The sound of approaching boots echoed in the darkness, growing louder with each step. The faint glow of the emergency lights cast jagged shadows across the walls of the depot as Sarah clutched the drives against her chest, her heart pounding in the oppressive silence. The sound of boots was drawing closer, each step amplified in the narrow corridor. William's fingers hovered over the small hacking device he had placed on the vault's biometric lock, its lights flickering erratically as it worked to override the system. Hurry, Sarah whispered, her voice taut with fear. William's jaw was clenched, his eyes locked on the device. It's almost there. Just hold on. The sound of the approaching guards grew louder, their voices cutting through the air. Orders barked in sharp tones, the scrape of weapons readying for confrontation. The corridor felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against them with the weight of inevitability. The device beeped, a single, sharp tone that cut through the tension like a blade. The vault's lock released with a heavy click, and the reinforced door slid open. Without hesitation, William pushed Sarah inside, following her and pulling the door closed behind them just as the first burst of gunfire erupted. Inside the vault, the air was colder, the walls lined with rows of servers and shelves filled with encrypted drives. The hum of machinery was the only sound, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. William locked the door from the inside and turned to Sarah, his face a mask of resolve. This is it, he said, his voice steady. We get what we need and get out. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she moved to the nearest terminal. She connected the drives she had collected earlier and began downloading the data onto an external device, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. What's on these drives? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything Hayes has tried to hide, William replied, scanning the room for anything they might have missed. Names, accounts, operations. Enough to bring him and his entire network down. And Delaney? She pressed. William hesitated. If he's smart, he's already running. But if his name's in here, he didn't finish, the implication hanging heavily in the air. The progress bar on the screen crawled forward, agonizingly slow. Outside, the sound of gunfire and shouting grew louder, closer. William moved to the door, his weapon drawn, his body tense. They'll breach this door soon, he said grimly. How much longer? Almost there, Sarah said, her voice tight. Just keep them out. A sudden crash reverberated through the room as something heavy slammed against the door. Sarah jumped, her heart racing as the screen finally blinked, signaling the download's completion. Got it, she exclaimed, pulling the device from the terminal and stuffing it into her bag. William turned to her, his expression fierce. Then we move. Now. The corridor outside the vault was a war zone. Smoke filled the air, mingling with the acrid smell of burnt metal and gunpowder. The bodies of guards and Hayes loyalists littered the ground, their weapons discarded where they fell. William led the way, his movements sharp and precise, while Sarah followed close behind, clutching her bag tightly. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with Hayes. His suit was smeared with ash, his face a mask of fury, but his gun was steady as he aimed it directly at William. Drop the bag, Hayes barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Now? Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. William stepped in front of her, his own weapon raised. The two men stared each other down, the tension between them crackling like static. You've already lost, William said, his voice low and controlled. The drives are out of here. Your operation's done. Hayes laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You think you're the hero in this story, Harris? You've killed men, broken every rule in the book, and for what? Because you don't even understand. William's jaw tightened, but he didn't waver. You've got nothing left, Hayes. Walk away while you still can. But Hayes didn't lower his weapon. Instead, his gaze shifted to Sarah, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. You really think you can trust him? He asked her, his tone mocking. You're just another pawn in his game. Sarah's grip on her bag tightened, her mind racing. Hayes' words cut deep, but the look in William's eyes, steady, unwavering, kept her grounded. I trust him more than I'll ever trust you, she said firmly. Hayes' smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but before he could respond, a burst of gunfire echoed through the corridor. Myers appeared at the far end, his weapon blazing as he took down two of Hayes' remaining guards. The distraction was enough for William to act. He lunged at Hayes, the two men colliding in a brutal struggle. The gun clattered to the ground as they grappled, their movements desperate and violent. Sarah watched in frozen terror as the fight unfolded, her hands clutching the bag like a lifeline. Go! William shouted over his shoulder. Get out of here! Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stay, to help. But Myers grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. We don't have time, he yelled. Move! The cold night air hit Sarah like a shock as she and Myers burst out of the depot. The glow of the flames from the earlier explosion lit up the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the tree line, where Myers finally collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. Sarah turned back, her chest tight. We can't just leave him, she said, her voice breaking. Myers looked at her, his face pale but resolute. He knew what he was doing, he said. If he's still alive, he'll find us. The words offered little comfort, and Sarah felt a hollow ache settle in her chest. But before she could respond, a faint figure emerged from the depot, staggering toward them. It was William. His face was bloodied, his movements unsteady, but he was alive. Sarah ran to him, relief flooding through her as she helped him to the ground. It's done, he said, his voice hoarse. Hayes is gone. Sarah didn't ask how. She could see the answer in his eyes. Instead, she pulled the drives from her bag, holding them up. And so is his operation. William nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Then we've won. The sunrise broke over the horizon as the three of them sat in the clearing, the weight of the night's events settling heavily on their shoulders. The drives were safe, the evidence secured, but the cost was undeniable. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. William stared at the horizon, his expression distant. We finish what we started, he said. We take this to the people who can make it count. And then, Myers asked, his tone laced with weary skepticism. William looked at him, his gaze steady. Then we try to live with it. As the sun rose higher, casting warm light over the forest, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she believed they might have a chance to win.